Everyday sa bahay daming activities, kaya breakfast pa lang give them champion energy.
Milo breakfast every day. Milo breakfast every day helps you jumpstart your day. Milo every day.
Help make breakfast more nutritious with Milo. May winning combination ng milk, champion energy nutrients, at choco multi sarap.
Milo breakfast every day. Milo breakfast every day helps you jumpstart your day. Milo every day.
From Nestle.
Ang susunod na programa ay rated PG. Ito ay nangangailangan ng patnubay at gabay ng magulang para sa mga batang manonood.
Good afternoon, Philippines. It's Saturday, April 1st, and you're watching ITV News. This is Abigail Joy de los Reyes,
General Borben,
Leila Janel Hernandez,
Ruth Calderon.
and Maria Julia Isabella Reyes, your news anchors for today.
Bringing you the latest news around the globe.
Now let us have a glance at the news headline. The Global Trade and Investment Environment International Trade Theory. For the details of our news, overview of trade theory, mercantilism, absolute advantage, comparative advantage, extra all-in theory, the productive life cycle theory, new trade theory, national competitive advantage, Porter's diamond, focus on managerial implications.
For the introduction, we will be discussing about the tale of two nations, South Korea and Ghana, the benefits of trade, the pattern of international trade, and trade theory and government policy. A tale of two nations, Ghana and South Korea. In 1970, South Korea and the West African nation of Ghana had similar living standards. South Korea had a GDP per capita of $260 and Ghana had a GDP per capita of $250. Nearly 50 years later, South Korea became one of the largest economies in the world with a GDP per capita of $32,000, while Ghana's GDP per capita was just $1,786. We can clearly see that South Korea has grown much faster than Ghana over the last half-century. According to a World Bank study, this could be due to the different attitudes of both countries toward international trade during the second half of the 20th century. Ghana gained its independence from Great Britain in 1957. The first president in the country was Kwame Nkrumah. His policies included high tariffs on many imported goods in an effort to foster self-sufficiency, and the adoption of policies that discourage exports. The results of these inward-oriented policies were a disaster for Ghana. For example, when Ghana gained independence, they became one of the major producer and exporter of cocoa because of their favorable climate, good soils, and ready access to world shipping routes. Furthermore, the government created a state-controlled cocoa marketing board, which they are the one who set prices and sole buyer of cocoa in the country. However, the board was taxing exports by paying cocoa farmers or producers considerably less than they would get for their product on the world market. As a result, farmers started to switch from producing cocoa to producing subsistence foodstuffs that could be sold profitably within Ghana. Therefore, the country's production of cocoa and its cocoa exports decreased rapidly. By the 1980s, Ghana was a country in economic crisis, with falling exports and a lack of foreign currency earnings to pay for imports. In contrast, South Korea embraced a policy of low import barriers on manufactured goods and the creation of incentives to promote exports. These policies of reducing import tariffs and restrictive import quotas as well as lowering tax rates on export earnings dramatically raised the living standards of an average Korean. The opening case illustrates the gains that can come from international trade. The economic policies of the Ghanaian government discouraged trade with other nations. The result was a shift in Ghana's resources away from productive uses such as producing cocoa to unproductive uses such as subsistence agriculture. While the economic policies of the South Korean government strongly encourage trade with other nations. These differing policies of both countries toward international trade made one go significantly faster than the other. Let's now go on to the benefits of trade. Common sense suggests that some international trade is beneficial. For instance, nobody would dare to say that Iceland should grow its own oranges because given their climate, soil, and other factors, it's not just possible. However, Iceland can benefit from trade by exchanging the products that it can produce at a low cost, such as fish, for the products that it can't produce at all, such as oranges. Hence, international trade allows a country to specialize in the manufacture and export of products that can be produced most efficiently in that country, while importing products that can be produced more efficiently in other countries. All of that being said, countries still threatened by imports, and one of their action was to control it. Such action may benefit particular groups, but different theories suggest that it also hurt the economy as a whole. One of the key insights of international trade theory is that limits on imports are often in the interest of domestic producers but not on domestic consumers. Some aspects of the pattern of international trade are easy to understand, such as climate and the quality of natural resources possessed by a country, which also explain why Ghana exports cocoa, Brazil exports coffee, and Saudi Arabia exports oil. However, many observed pattern of international trade is more difficult to explain. But I will be mentioning 5 different theories that will give us an overview regarding the pattern of international trade, and it will also be discussed further later. First is the David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage. This offers an explanation about the pattern of international trade in terms of differences in labor productivity. Second is the Hexer-Ollin theory. It rests on the assumption that countries have varying quality and ability possessed in terms of factors of production. Third is the product life cycle theory. This was proposed by Raymond Vernon. It is said that as a new product becomes widely accepted internationally, production starts in other countries. As a result, the theory suggests that the product may ultimately be exported back to the country of its original innovation. Fourth is the new trade theory, which was developed by Paul Krugman. It is said that in some cases, firms that enter the market first are able to build competitive advantage that is subsequently difficult to challenge. Thus, the observed pattern of the trade between nations may be due to the ability of firms within a given nation to capture first-mover advantages. Lastly, in relation to new trade theory, Michael Porter's theory of national competitive advantage points out the importance of country factors such as domestic demand and domestic rivalry in explaining the dominance of certain country in the production and export of particular products. All these theories agree that international trade is beneficial to a country. However, it lacks agreement in their recommendations for government policy. Like in mercantilism, it promotes exports and limits imports. The theories of Smith, Ricardo, and Hexer-Ollin promote unrestricted free trade, and both new trade theory and national competitive advantage theory justify some limited government intervention to support certain export-oriented industries. So, it is important for us to understand each theory, especially on how it viewed international trade. The first theory of international trade is mercantilism. This theory emerged in England in the mid-16th century. At that time, gold and silver were the currency of trade between countries. A country could earn gold and silver by exporting goods, and an outflow of gold and silver from that country could result because of importing goods. The main principle of mercantilism was that it was in a country's best interest to maintain a trade surplus, meaning to export more than it imported. With that, a country could accumulate gold and silver, which will increase its national wealth, prestige, and power. This was best stated by an English mercantilist writer, Thomas Moon. He said that the ordinary means therefore to increase our wealth and treasure is by foreign trade, wherein we must ever observe this rule, to sell more to strangers yearly than we consume of theirs in value. This theory recommended policies to maximize exports and minimize imports. The classical economist David Hume pointed out an inconsistency in the mercantilist doctrine in 1752. According to him, in the long run, no country could sustain a surplus on the balance of trade and so accumulate gold and silver as the mercantilists had predicted. For instance, if England exported more than it imported with France, the resulting inflow of gold and silver would swell the domestic money and supply and will generate inflation in England. On the other hand, the outflow of gold and silver in France will cause their money supply to shrink and its prices fall. The flow of mercantilism was that it viewed trade as a zero-sum game, meaning a gain by one country results in a loss by another, rather than a positive sum game, meaning all countries can benefit. The second theory of international trade is absolute advantage. Adam Smith, an 18th century Scottish philosopher and considered the father of modern economics, attacked the mercantilist assumption that trade is a zero-sum game in his 1776 book, The Wealth of Nations. According to him, countries should specialize in the production of goods for which they have an absolute advantage, meaning they are more efficient at producing it than any other country, and then trade these goods for those produced by other countries. Smith's basic argument is that a country should never produce goods in its own that it can buy at a lower cost from other countries. He demonstrates that by specializing in the production of goods in which each has an absolute advantage, both countries engaged in trading will benefit. To illustrate, assume that Ghana and South Korea both have the same amount of resources, and these resources can be used to produce either rice or cocoa. So each has 200 units of resources available. If Ghana needs 10 resources to produce 1 ton of cocoa and 20 resources to produce 1 ton of rice, then the country could produce 20 tons of cocoa and no rice, 10 tons of rice and no cocoa, or some combination of rice and cocoa between these two extremes. On the other hand, if South Korea takes 40 resources to produce 1 ton of cocoa and 10 resources to produce 1 ton of rice, then the country could produce 5 tons of cocoa and no rice, 20 tons of rice and no cocoa, or some combination of rice and cocoa between these two extremes. Therefore, we can conclude that Ghana has an absolute advantage in the production of cocoa and South Korea has an absolute advantage in the production of rice. Now, let's consider a situation in which neither Ghana nor South Korea trade with one another. With its resources devoted to both production of rice and cocoa, Ghana would be able to produce 10 tons of cocoa and 5 tons of rice, and South Korea would be able to produce 10 tons of rice and 2.5 tons of cocoa. Clearly, without trade, the combined production of both countries would decrease. Also, as we can see on the table presented, by engaging in trade and swapping 1 ton of cocoa for 1 ton of rice, producers in both countries could consume more of both goods. Thus, we can conclude that trade is a positive sum game because it produces net gains for all involved. That would be all for my report. To educate us about comparative advantage, let's hear from Isabella Reyes. Sub.
Thank you, Leila. Now I will be discussing the comparative advantage. David Ricardo was a classical economist best known for his theory on wages and profit, the labor theory of value, the theory of comparative advantage, and the theory of rents. But today I will be talking about the theory of comparative advantage. Among the notable ideas that Ricardo introduced was the theory of comparative advantage, which argued that countries can benefit from international trade by specializing in the production of goods for which they have a relatively lower opportunity cost in production, even if they do not have an absolute advantage in the production of any particular good. Dito, ang goal natin is to have a lower opportunity cost. Wini-weigh kasi natin dito yung advantage sa theory na to. So, for us to better understand what is it about, let us define first what opportunity cost is so that we're on the same page. Opportunity cost is the value of the next best alternative foregone in making a decision. In other words, it is the cost of giving up the one opportunity in order to pursue another. Opportunity cost is an important concept in economics because it helps to explain why people and countries make certain choices and how they allocate their resources. So, for example, meron kang 100,000 pesos to spend, and you choose to spend it on a concert ticket. The opportunity cost of that decision is the value of the next best alternative you could have chosen with that 100,000 pesos, such as going out to dinner or buying a new outfit. If the value of the next best alternative is higher than the value of the concert ticket to you, then you have to incur an opportunity cost by choosing to attend a concert. Let's go back to the theory. Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage is an economic theory that explains how countries can benefit from one trade even if one country has an absolute advantage in the production of all goods. So, according to Ricardo's theory, a country should specialize in producing and exporting the goods that it can produce at a lower opportunity cost than other countries while importing the goods that it cannot produce as efficiently. Comparative advantage is contrasted with absolute advantage, which was discussed earlier by Miss Leila. Absolute advantage refers to the ability to produce more or better goods and services than somebody else. Comparative advantage refers to the ability to produce goods and services at a lower opportunity cost, not necessarily at a greater volume or quality. So let's discuss yung given example sa module. So in Ghana, you need 1 ton of cocoa, which requires 10 resources, while 1 ton of rice requires 13.33 resources. And then Ghana can produce 20 tons of cocoa and no rice, or they have a choice of producing 15 tons of rice and no rice, or any mix in between on its PPF or the line GG or yung red slope, given its 200 units of resources. Compared to South Korea, they require 1 ton of cocoa, which needs 40 resources to create, compared to 20 resources to generate 1 ton of rice. Hence, under PPF, the line KK or yung green slope, South Korea can produce 5 tons of cocoa and no rice, or they can produce 10 tons of rice and no cocoa, or any combination. So, if you will let these countries alone and assume that there will be no trade happening, so Ghana will produce a total of 10 tons of cocoa and 7.5 tons of rice, which is the point A, while South Korea will produce 2.5 tons of cocoa only and 5 tons of rice, which is the point B. So without trade, each country must consume what it produces. By engaging in trade, the two countries can increase their combined production of rice and cocoa, and consumers in both nations can consume more of both goods or commodities. So now we assume that they will dive into trading. Envision Ghana increasing its output of cocoa from 10 tons to 15 tons by taking advantage of its comparative advantage. The remaining 50 units of resources can be used to produce 3.75 tons of rice after this uses up 150 units of resources, which is yung point C. South Korea produces 10 tons of rice in an expert in the field, Rice and cocoa production as a whole has now increased. Prior to specialization, 12.5 tons of cocoa and 12.5 tons of rice were produced collectively. Currently, there are 15 tons of cocoa and 13.75 tons of rice, with 3.75 tons coming from Ghana and 10 tons from South Korea. So together with increased output, trade now benefits both countries. Both Ghana and South Korea were able to consume more cocoa and rice than they could before specialization and trade if they choose to exchange 4 tons of their export and 4 tons of imports of a one-to-one basis. So what are the benefits of this comparative advantage? It increased efficiency. By specializing the production of goods and services in which they have a comparative advantage, countries can increase their efficiency in the use of resources, leading to increased output and lower costs. It also lowers prices. So comparative advantage leads to a lower prices for goods and services as countries are able to produce more efficiently and take advantage of economies of scale. Increased global cooperation. Comparative advantage promotes global cooperation and peaceful trade relations as countries recognize the benefit of specialization and trade. Improve resource allocation. By specializing in the production of goods and services in which they have a comparative advantage, countries can allocate their resources more efficiently, leading to a more optimal allocation of resources both domestically and globally. The basic message of this theory of comparative advantage is that potential world production is greater with unrestricted free trade than with restricted trade. Ricardo's theory suggests that consumers in all nations can consume more if there are no restrictions on trade. This occurs even in countries that lack an absolute advantage in the production of any good. In other words, to an even greater degree than the theory of absolute advantage, the theory of comparative advantage suggests that trade is a positive sum game which all countries that participate realize economic gains. When we say positive sum game, there must be no loser. So there are some assumptions about free trade which are shown in our slide now. The conclusion that free trade is mutually beneficial may not always apply in the real world of many countries. Many goods, positive transportation costs, volatile exchange rates, immobile domestic resources, non-constant returns to specialization, and dynamic changes. Sa totoong mundo kasi maraming factors ang nakakaapekto sa free trade. So for example, transportation costs can make it difficult for some countries to compete in certain industries even if they have a comparative advantage in production. Exchange rate fluctuations can also affect the competitiveness of exports and imports, leading to unpredictable outcomes. Moreover, some countries may have immobile domestic resources such as lack of skilled labor or natural resources, which can limit their ability to compete in certain industries. Ricardian model is a theory na dinevelop din ni David Ricardo noong 19th century. Basically, it is based on the assumption of perfect competition and that only difference between countries is that relative productivity in producing different goods. Sinasabi sa theory nito na ang bawat bansa ay dapat magkaroon ng specialization when it comes to producing and exporting their goods in consideration with its comparative advantage. By this kasi, countries can increase their overall production and consumption, leading to a greater economic welfare. We have immobile resources. So the article discusses how resources do not always shift easily from one economic activity to another, which creates friction and human suffering. Free trade can lead to the production of more knowledge-intensive goods and less labor-intensive goods. Pwede ito mag-result sa pagkaubos ng mga trabaho para sa mga trabahador na may kakulangan. This can cause opposition to free trade from those who are most at risk of losing their jobs. Governments can help ease the transition to free trade by providing job training programs for affected workers. Although the pain caused by the transition is short-term, the gains from trade once the transition is made are significant and enduring. Just to be clear, kapag kasi sinabi natin immobile resources, the way economics define it is that ito yung assets or resources ng isang company na hindi basta-basta namumove from one place to another. So for example, there is a particular type of skilled labor or natural resource which may be immobile between countries due to factors like language barriers, legal restrictions, or cultural differences. So there could be a lot of factors that can affect your resource to be immobile. In terms of this model, which is yung Ricardian model of international trade, itong mga resources na to can affect the ability ng isang bansa to specialize and trade. If yung bansa has a comparative advantage in a good or commodity na gumagamit ng immobile resources, then it may not be able to fully exploit that advantage and increase its exports. So this can result in suboptimal outcomes such as lower levels of production and consumption, which is hindi mangyayari if only yung resources is mobile or movable. We also have diminishing returns. So the initial increase in output gained by adding more units of a factor of production will eventually level off to become less efficient. This concept applies to both physical and human capital. The law of diminishing returns is an important concept in economic theory as it helps to explain the relationship between inputs and outputs in production processes. So it also has implications for the optimal level of input used in the production process and can be used to determine the most efficient use of resources. So it is more realistic to assume diminishing returns for two reasons. So first, not all resources are of the same quality. As a country tries to increase its output of a certain good, it is increasingly likely to draw on more marginal resources whose productivity is not as great as those initially employed. The result is that it requires ever more resources to produce an equal increase in output. This means that adding more of a certain type of resource, such as labor or capital, to a production process will not always lead to the same increase in output. For example, a highly skilled worker may be more productive than an unskilled worker. So adding more unskilled workers may not lead to the same increase in output as adding more skilled workers. This is why the concept of diminishing returns is more realistic, as it recognizes the adding more resources will eventually lead to smaller and smaller increases in output. Second is that for diminishing return, different goods use resources in different proportions. This means that the resources needed to produce one good may not be the same as those needed to produce another good. For example, producing 1 unit of product A may require more labor and less capital than producing 1 unit of product B. As a result, as more and more of a particular good is produced, the resources required to produce each additional unit will likely become more expensive, leading to diminishing returns. Both of these reasons support the idea of diminishing returns and suggest that the relationship between the inputs used in production and the resulting output is not always linear. Instead, it may be curved, indicating that additional inputs will eventually lead to smaller and smaller increases in output. Diminishing returns show that it is not feasible for a country to specialize to the degree suggested by the simple Ricardian model outlined earlier. Diminishing returns to specialization suggests that the gains from specialization are likely to be exhausted before specialization is complete. In reality, most countries do not specialize, but instead produce a range of goods. However, the theory predicts that it is worthwhile to specialize until that point where the resulting gains from trade are outweighed by diminishing returns. Thus, the basic conclusion that unrestricted free trade is beneficial still holds, although because of diminishing returns, the gains may not be as great as suggested in the constant return case. Before we proceed to dynamic effects and economic growth, we will be right back for more hot news after this commercial break.
Alam natin ang feeling na yan. Yung sobrang init, pati ulo mo umiinit. Eh ang gusto mo lang naman ay mag-chill. Bigat sa feeling ng init na yan. Pero okay lang. Dahil easy na lang mag-cool down with the #1 lemon and lime refreshment, Sprite. O diba? Ganun lang kasimple. Mainit? Cool ka lang with Sprite.
Welcome back to IBT News. This is Ruth Marion Calderon reporting live. Let's now proceed to the dynamic effects and economic growth. The simple comparative advantage model makes the assumption that trade has no impact on a nation's resource stock or resource use efficiency. A country's stock of resources may rise as a result of free trade as more foreign labor and capital becomes accessible for domestic use. Free trade may also improve how effectively a nation uses its resources. Gains in resources consumption efficiency could result from a variety of circumstances. Better technology from other countries may become available to home companies through trade. Better technology can raise labor productivity and land productivity. By exposing an economy to international competition, domestic manufacturers may become more motivated to find ways to boost their productivity. Many former state monopolies in Eastern Europe's once protected markets have probably been experiencing this phenomenon as they have had to improve the efficiency of their operations to compete in the cutthroat global marketplace. In other words, comparative advantage in international trade may affect a country's production pattern and in turn its demand for external finance. And to sum it up, dynamic effects can be competitiveness, technological development, scale economies, resource allocation, and investment. And now, we have here the trade, jobs, and wages, the Samuelson critic. Paul Samuelson's critic examines what transpires when a wealthy country signs a free trade agreement with a developing nation that quickly increases its productivity after implementing a free trade system. According to Samuelson's model, decreased costs paid by U.S. consumers for items imported from China could not be sufficient to result in a net benefit for the U.S. economy. He added, and I quote, "Being able to purchase groceries 20% cheaper at Walmart due to international trade does not necessarily make up for the wage losses." End of quote. In an interview with the New York Times. Samuelson was especially worried about the potential for service positions that were not typically internationally mobile to be outsourced, such as software debugging, call center work, accountancy occupations, and etc. This has been made possible by developments in communications technology since the creation of the World Wide Web in the early 1990s, thereby extending the labor market for these positions to educated individuals in nations like India, the Philippines, and China. Having said that, it should be highlighted that Samuelson acknowledges the historical advantages of free trade for wealthy nations. According to Ricardo's thesis, productivity disparities are what give rise to comparative advantage. He also stated that the concept of comparative advantage is supported by variations in worker productivity between countries. However, according to the Heckscher-Ohlin theory, which was created by Swedish economists Eli Heckscher and Bertil Ohlin, differences in national factor endowments are what give rise to comparative advantage. The pattern of global trade we notice is explained by this area. According to this theory, nations will export commodities that heavily rely on locally abundant resources while importing those that don't. This theory makes sense in a logical way. For instance, China has excelled at exporting commodities made in labor-intensive manufacturing industries, while the United States has traditionally been a significant exporter of agricultural goods. Essentially, this theory argued that a nation should import that it lacks in order to export what it has. The Heckscher-Ohlin theory has been one of the most influential theoretical ideas in international economics, and because of that, the theory has been subjected to many empirical tests. However, a famous study published in 1953 by Wassily Leontief raised questions about the validity of the Heckscher-Ohlin theory. Leontief postulated that the United States would be an exporter of capital-intensive goods and an importer of labor-intensive than imports. He found that United States exports were less capital-intensive than U.S. imports. This result was at variance with the predictions of the theory that has become known as the Leontief paradox. Because they favor the Heckscher-Ohlin theory on theoretical grounds, economists face a challenging conundrum. Returning to the Ricardian theory, that trade patterns are already significantly influenced by global productivity disparities may be the best way to resolve the conundrum. The Heckscher-Ohlin theory makes a universality of technologies across nations a central tenet, but perhaps this is not the case. According to the current research, if technological differences between nations are taken into account, countries do export commodities that heavily rely on locally abundant resources while importing goods that heavily rely on locally scarce resources.
Thank you, Ruth. So for the next international trade theory, we have the product life cycle by Raymond Vernon. But before proceeding to the theory itself, let us first discover who Raymond Vernon is. So he is an American economist who played a role in the development of the International Monetary Fund and the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade. When we say International Monetary Fund, it refers to the major financial agency in the United Nations. It works to foster global monetary cooperation, to secure financial stability, to facilitate international trade, to promote high employment and sustainable economic growth, and of course to reduce the overall poverty around the globe. Meanwhile, when we say the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, it refers to the legal agreement between many countries whose overall purpose was to promote international trade and to reduce or, let us say, eliminate trade barriers such as the tariffs and quotas. The product life cycle theory assumes that the early production of a new product will occur completely in the home country of its innovation. However, it still ends up becoming an item that is also imported by its original country of innovation due to the lower production costs on other nations. So, with Vernon's theory, it was based on his observation that for most of the 20th century, a very large proportion of the world's new products had been developed by the US firms and, of course, sold first in the US market. Let us take, for example, the mass production of the television, the instant cameras, photocopiers, personal computers, and semiconductor chips. Further, Vernon argues that most new products were initially produced in America. Apparently, the pioneering firms believed it was better to keep production facilities close to the market and to the firm's center of decision-making due to the uncertainty and risk inherent in introducing new products. Also, the demand for most new products tend to be based on a non-price factors. Consequently, firms can charge relatively high prices for new products, which obviates the need to look for low-cost production sites in other countries. So usually the early life cycle of a typical product or typical new product, when the demand is just starting to grow rapidly in the United States, the demand in other countries is limited only to those who are within the high income groups. That is why it is not worthwhile for the firms in those countries to start producing the new product. But it does necessitate some export from the United States to those countries. But over time, the demand for these new products also starts to grow in other countries. And as it does grow, it becomes worthwhile for foreign producers to begin producing for their home market. Consequently, this increase on suppliers or producers or the production within these countries begins to limit the potential exports for the United States or the original home country of the product. We can see that there are 3 stages within the product life cycle theory. First, we have the new product. This is where the new product is introduced to the market, where the customers are still unaware about what the product is. In order to create demand, the producers promote the new product to stimulate sales. At this stage, profits are still low, but it starts increasing and there are few to none competitors. For the second one, we have the maturing product. It is when the product enters the world market because its foreign demand increases and the product is now exported to different developed countries. So with this stage is also when the original producers start to consider building production facilities to those high-demand nations. For the third one, we have the product in standardization. Product standardization or the situations when there is a decrease in the demand for the original product and the production moves to a new nation. As the market in the United States, or let us say the original country who produces the item, and other advanced nation matures, the product becomes more standardized. Together with this, the price also becomes the main competitive weapon. As this occurs, cost considerations starts to play a greater role in the competitive process. Producers in advanced countries where labor costs are lower than the United States, like the Italy and Spain, they might now be able to export to the United States instead of importing from the United States. The consequence of these trends for the pattern of world trade is that over time, the United States or the original producer switches from being an exporter of the product to an importer of the product as production becomes concentrated in lower costs foreign locations. To further understand the topic, let us take a look on the product life cycle of the photocopiers from United States. So the case was that the product was initially developed or first developed in the early 1960s by Xerox in the United States and sold initially to US users only. Then the product is exported to other nations, and as demands began to grow in these nations or in these countries, Xerox decided to enter into a joint ventures to set up production in Japan and as well as in Great Britain. So once Xerox patents on the photocopier process expired, other foreign competitors began to enter their market. So as a consequence, export from United States declined and the US users also began purchasing or buying some photocopiers from low-cost foreign sources, particularly Japan. So as a continuation of this pattern, Japanese companies have also recently found out that manufacturing costs in their country are higher. So they have began to switch production to other developing countries such as the Thailand. Thus, currently the United States and other advanced countries who are initially the producers of the photocopiers have also switched from being an exporters of photocopiers to the importers of these items. This evolution in the pattern of international trade in photocopiers is consistent with the prediction of the product life cycle by Vernon, wherein it states that mature industries tend to go out of United States and go into the low-cost assembly locations over time. The product life cycle in the 21st century. Vernon's argument that most new products are developed and introduced in the United States seems ethnocentric and dated. Many new products are now first introduced in Japan or in South Korea. Moreover, with the increased globalization and integration of the world economy, as we have discussed in Chapter 1, an increasing number of new products are now simultaneously introduced in the United States and many European as well as Asian nations. So, in other words, Vernon's theory of product life cycle may be useful in explaining the pattern of international trade during the American global dominance in the market. But however, its relevance in the modern world seems a little bit more limited compared to the 20th century. Now that we're done talking about Vernon's product life cycle, it is time to talk about the new trade theory, which focuses on the importance of economies of scale and the first mover advantage. New trade theory began to emerge in 1970s when a number of economists pointed out that the ability of firms to attain economies of scale might have important implications for international trade. Economies of scale are unit cost reduction associated with a large scale of output. Economies of scale have a number of sources, including the ability to spread the fixed cost over a large volume and the ability of large volume producers to utilize specialized employees and equipment that are more productive than those that are less specialized. The new trade theory has two main points. The first one is that through its impact on economies of scale, trade can increase the variety of goods available to consumers and decrease the average costs of those goods. The second one is that in those industries in which the output required to attain economies of scale represents a significant proportion of the total world demand, the global market may be able to support only a small number of enterprises. So basically, in other words, according to the new trade theory, the world trade in certain products may be dominated by countries whose firms were what we call the first mover in the production, increasing product variety and reducing costs. According to the new trade theory, each nation may be able to specialize in producing a narrower range of products than it would be in the absence of trade. Yet by buying goods that it does not make from the other countries, each nation can simultaneously increase the variety of goods available to its consumers and at the same time lower the costs. Thus, the trade or trading offers an opportunity for mutual gain even when the countries do not differ in their resource endowment or technology. Let us take, for example, there is a demand for sports car that's limited to 50,000 units in each national market, while a total amount or total output of at least 100,000 per year may be required to realize significant scale economies. Similarly, demand for a minivan may be 80,000 units in each national market, and again, a total output of at least 100,000 per year may be required to realize significant scale economies. Considering the fact that there is a limited domestic market demand, the firms in each nation may decide not to produce a sports car because the costs of doing so is greater because it does not meet the required units for the economies of scale. And although they may produce minivans, the cost of doing so will also be higher than if significant economies of scale had been attained. However, once these two countries decide to trade, a firm in one nation may specialize in producing sports cars, while the firm in the other nation may focus on producing the minivans. The combined demand for 110,000 sports car and 160,000 minivans allows each firm to realize economies of scale. Consumers in this case benefit from having access to this product or to the sports cars that was not available before in the international trade, and from the lower price for the product that could not be produced at the most efficient scale before international trade. With this, we can conclude that trade is mutually beneficial because it allows the specialization of production, the rationalization of scale economies or the economies of scale, and the production of a greater variety of product and lower prices. As mentioned earlier, economies of scale are unit cost reduction associated with a large scale of output and when production becomes efficient. The new trade theory assumes that economy and certain pattern of trade may be the result of economies of scale and the first mover advantage. The first mover advantage are economic and strategic advantage that accrue to the early entrants into the industry. It includes the ability to capture scale economies ahead of later entrants and thus benefit from a lower cost structure. This is supported by a study of a Harvard business historian named Alfred Chandler, which suggests that the existence of the first mover advantage is an important factor in explaining the dominance of firms from a certain nation in a specific industry. The new trade theory argues that there are patterns wherein countries dominate in the export of a certain goods because economies of scale are important in their production and because firms located in those countries were the first to capture economies of scale in the industry. The implications of new trade theory are as follows. The theory suggests that nations may benefit from trade even when they do not differ in resource endowments or technology. A country may predominate in the export of goods simply because it was lucky enough to have one or more firms among the first to produce that product. Then, new trade theory is at variance in the export of in variance with the Hector-Ohlin theory, which suggests that a country will predominate in the export of a product when it is particularly well endowed with those factors used intensively in its manufacture. The new trade theory is not in variance or not at variance with the theory of comparative advantage. It is because it particularly highlights the importance or the factor or the effect of the first mover advantage in the status of the firm or the country's economy. And then, the new trade theory generates for government intervention and strategic trade policy. And lastly, new trade theorists stress the role of luck, entrepreneurship, and innovation in giving a firm's first mover advantages.
National competitive advantage, an assessment of a nation's ability to participate competitively in international market. So in this report, we will be talking about the Porter-Diamond, properly referred to as the Porter-Diamond theory of national advantage, which is a model that is designed to help understand the competitive advantage that nations or groups possess due to certain factors available to them, and to explain how governments can act as catalysts to improve a country's position in a globally competitive economic environment. Who is Michael Eugene Porter? Michael Eugene Porter is an American academic known for his theories on economics, business strategy, and social causes. Michael Porter, the famous Harvard strategy professor, has also written extensively on international trade. Porter and his team looked at 100 industries in 10 nations. Like the work of the new trade theorist, Porter's work was driven by a belief that existing theories of international trade told only part of the story. For Porter, the essential task was to explain why a nation achieves international success in a particular industry. Why does Japan do so well in automobile industry? Why do Germany and the United States do so well in the chemical industry? These questions cannot be answered easily by the Heckscher-Ohlin theory, and the theory of comparative advantage offers only a partial explanation. The theory of comparative advantage would say that Switzerland excels in the production and export of precision instruments because it uses its resources very productively in these industries. Although this may be correct, this does not explain why Switzerland is more productive in this industry than Great Britain, Germany, or Spain. That's why Porter tries to solve this puzzle. This diamond model was created by Michael Porter. This is a proactive economic theory rather than one that simply quantifies competitive advantages that a country or region may have. This Porter diamond model is a model designed to describe the effect that attributes of domestic markets have on the competitive advantage of firms or nations in the international market. Porter theorizes that four broad attributes of a nation shape the environment in which local firms compete, and these attributes promote or impede the creation of competitive advantage. These attributes are factor endowments, demand conditions, related and supporting industries, and firm strategy, structure, and rivalry. Porter speaks of these four attributes as constituting the diamond. He argues that firms are most likely to succeed in industries or industry segments where the diamond is most favorable. He also argues that the diamond is a mutually reinforcing system, meaning the effect of one attribute is contingent on the state of others. Porter maintains that two additional variables, which are the chance and the government, can influence the national diamond in important ways. Chance events, such as major innovations, can reshape industry structure and provide the opportunity for one nation's firm to supplant another's. Government, by its choice of policies, can detract from or improve national advantage. For example, regulation can alter home demand conditions, antitrust policies can influence the intensity of rivalry within an industry, and government investments in education can change factor endowment. The Porter diamond model is visually represented by a diagram that resembles the 4 points of a diamond. The 4 points represent four interrelated determinants that Porter theorizes as the deciding factors of national comparative economic advantage. These four factors are factor endowments, demand conditions, related and supporting industries, firm strategy, structure, and rivalry. Factor endowments refer to a nation's position in factors of production such as skilled labor or the infrastructure necessary to compete in a given industry. Demand conditions are the nature of home country demand for the industry's product or service. Related and supporting industries refer to the presence or absence of supplier industries and related industries that are internationally competitive. Firm strategy, structure, and rivalry are the conditions governing how companies are created, organized, and managed, and the nature of domestic rivalry. To further understand, let's explain the factor endowments or factor conditions first. Factor endowments lie at the center of the Heckscher-Ohlin theory. While Porter does not propose anything radically new, he does analyze the characteristics of factors of productions. He recognizes hierarchies among factors, distinguishing between basic factors like natural resources, climate, location, and demographics, and advanced factors like communication infrastructure, sophisticated and skilled labor, research facilities, and technological know-how. He argues that these advanced factors are more important in determining a country's competitive advantage than naturally inherited factors. Unlike naturally endowed basic factors, advanced factors are a product of investment by individuals, companies, and governments. Thus, government investments in basic and higher education by improving the general skill and knowledge level of the population and by stimulating advanced research at higher education institutions can upgrade a nation's advanced factors. In other words, he suggests that the primary role of government in driving a nation's economy is to encourage and challenge businesses within the country to focus on the creation and development of the elements of factor conditions. To summarize everything up, factor conditions are those elements that Porter believes a country's economy can create for itself. Demand conditions. Demand conditions refer to the size and nature of a product's customer base, which drives innovation and product improvement. Larger, more dynamic consumer markets will demand and stimulate a need to differentiate and innovate, as well as simply greater market scale for businesses. Porter emphasizes the importance of home demand in improving competitive advantage. Firms are usually most concerned with the needs of their closest customers. According to Porter, a country's firms gain a competitive advantage if its domestic consumers are sophisticated and demanding. Such customers put pressure on local businesses to meet high product quality standards and to create innovative products. The third broad attribute of national advantage in an industry is the presence of suppliers or related industries that are internationally competitive. The benefits of investments and advanced factors of production by related and supporting industries can spill over into an industry, thereby helping it achieve a strong competitive position internationally. Upstream and downstream industries that facilitate innovation by exchanging ideas are referred to as related supporting industries. Depending on the level of transparency and knowledge transfer, these can stimulate innovation. For example, the Swedish strength in fabricated steel products has drawn on strengths in Sweden's specialty steel industry. Technological leadership in the U.S. semiconductor industry provided the basis for U.S. success in personal computers and several other technically advanced electronic products. Similarly, Switzerland's success in pharmaceuticals is closely related to its previous international success in the technologically related dye industry. One consequence of this process is that successful industries within a country tend to be grouped into clusters of related industries. This was one of the most pervasive findings of Porter's study. One such cluster Porter identified was in the German textile and apparel sector, which included high-quality cotton, wool, synthetic fibers, sewing machine needles, and a wide range of textile machinery. Such clusters are important because valuable knowledge can flow between the firms within a geographic cluster, benefiting all within that cluster. Knowledge flows occur when employees move between firms within a region and when national industry associations bring employees from different companies together for regular conferences or workshops. The fourth broad attribute of national competitive advantage is the strategy, structure, and rivalry of firms within a nation. Firm strategy, structure, and rivalry refer to the basic fact that competition leads to businesses finding ways to increase production and to the development of technological innovations. The concentration of market power, degree of competition, and ability of rival firms to enter a nation's market are influential here. Porter makes two important points. First, different nations are characterized by different management ideologies, which either help them or do not help them build national competitive advantage. Porter's second point is that there is a strong association between vigorous domestic rivalry and the creation and persistence of competitive advantage in an industry. Vigorous domestic rivalry induces firms to look for ways to improve efficiency, which makes them better international competitors. Domestic rivalry creates pressure to innovate, to improve quality, to reduce costs, and to invest in upgrading advanced factors. All this helps create world-class competitors. So to understand the national competitive advantage, let's now use the German car industry for a complete example. Let's look at each of the four determinants. First, let's look at factor conditions. So one factor condition that exists to make the German car industry competitive is the existence of specialist education establishments. Now, these establishments produce graduates within a specialism, obviously in car engineering. Now, being a global center for engineering excellence keeps the industry evolving at a rate that is difficult for competitors to keep up with. Next, demand conditions. Now, there is a strong and intense home demand for German cars, with consumers expecting better and better cars all the time. And also, on some autobahn, there is no speed limit, and this causes demand for cars with ever greater performance levels. And this intense demand combined with high expectations keeps competition high, and it's a furious competition that forces the industry to constantly evolve and makes it competitive internationally. Number 3, related and supporting industries. Now, there's many related industries and suppliers within Germany, but just one example is auto suppliers, such as Siemens and SAP. Now, these firms themselves have a global competitive advantage, but by working together with these firms, the car industry can enhance its national competitive advantage even further. Because now, they don't just have excellence engineering, but they also have excellent IT, and that raises the bar of entry for competitors even higher. It makes it even harder for them to enter the market. And finally, firm strategy structure and rivalry. Now, an intense intercompany rivalry between firms such as Mercedes, BMW, and Volkswagen feeds rapid innovation as each firm competes for the attention of customers. And finally, number 5, government. And this is one not to be overlooked in the success of the German car industry. That's the role of government in that success. Now, the government has invested in creating and funding institutions that reform scientific research, and those same institutions train the best engineers. The government has also invested in infrastructure. So by building new autobahn without speed limits, that helps intensify home demand conditions. By satisfying all determinants in the Porter-Diamond model, the German car industry has built a sustainable national competitive advantage, and this competitive advantage is further reinforced with the help of the government. So there are some criticisms which are often leveled at the Porter-Diamond model. The model was developed by examining just 10 developed countries, and because of this, the model only applies really to developed countries. There is much evidence also to show that the national competitiveness of the nation is influenced by factors which are outside that nation. Thirdly, not all firms which begin in the home country are successful, and that suggests that there may be other factors in play. And finally, it's not clear how the model applies in today's service economy. So for example, how can the model be used to analyze the success of McDonald's or Burger King's? So in summary, according to Porter's Diamond model, the degree to which a country is likely to achieve international success in a specific industry is determined by the combined impact of factor endowments, domestic demand conditions, related and supporting industries, and domestic rivalry. He contends that the presence of all four components is typically required for this diamond to enhance competitive performance, although there are exceptions. Porter also believes that government can have an impact on each of the diamond's four components, either positively or negatively. Domestic demand can be shaped by the government through local product standards or regulations that mandate or influence buyer needs. Regulation by the government can influence supporting and related industries, and firm rivalry can be influenced by capital market regulation, tax policy, and antitrust laws. Focus on managerial implications. Why does this matter for business? There are at least 3 main implications for international businesses: location implications, first mover implications, and government policy implications. Location. Underlying most of the theories we have discussed is the notion that different countries have particular advantages in different productive activities. Thus, from a profit perspective, it makes sense for a firm to disperse its productive activities to those countries where, according to the theory of international trade, they can be performed most efficiently. If design can be performed most efficiently in France, that is where design facilities should be located. If the manufacture of basic components can be performed most efficiently in Singapore, that is where they should be manufactured. And if final assembly can be performed most efficiently in China, that is where final assembly should be performed. The result is a global web of productive activities, with different activities being performed in different locations around the globe, depending on considerations of comparative advantage, factor endowments, and the like. If the firm does not do this, it may find itself at a competitive disadvantage relative to firms that do. Now let's talk about the first mover advantages. According to the new trade theory, firms that establish a first mover advantage with regard to the production of a particular new product may subsequently dominate global trade in that product. This is particularly true in industries where the global market can profitably support only a limited number of firms, such as the aerospace market. But early commitments may also seem to be important in less concentrated industries. For the individual firm, the clear message is that it pays to invest substantial financial resources in trying to build a first mover or early mover advantage, even if that means several years of losses before a new venture becomes profitable. Lastly, we have the government policy. The theories of international trade also matter to international businesses because firms are major players on the international trade scene. Business firms produce exports and business firms import the products of other countries. Because of their pivotal role in international trade, businesses can exert a strong influence on government trade policy, lobbying to promote free trade or trade restrictions. The theories of international trade claim that promoting free trade is generally in the best interest of a country, although it may not be always the best interest of an individual firm. Many firms recognize this and lobby for open markets. Porter's theory of national competitive advantage also contains policy implications. Porter's theory suggests that it is in the best interest of business for a firm to invest in upgrading advanced factors of production and to increase its commitment to research and development. It is also in the best interest of business to lobby the government to adopt policies that have a favorable impact on each component of the national diamond. Thus, according to Porter, businesses should urge government to increase investment in education, infrastructure, and basic research, and to adopt policies that promote strong competition within domestic markets. And that's all for today's Time Sizzling News. Once more, this is your anchor at service, Abigail de los Reyes,
Jenny Rose Orme,
Leila Jean Hernandez,
Ruth Calderon.
And Maria Julia Isabella Reyes.
Again, this is IBT News.
News with no exception.
delivering half but the truth.